I'm Timothy. Welcome to Last Memories. Today's episode didn't just qualify for a Darwin Award. They completely redefined what it means to deserve one. From a videographer near an MRI machine grabbing an oxygen tank for a selfie, to a woman building a massive gasoline bonfire in the desert, ending her night in the most destructive way possible. It was March 12, 2017, and honestly, nothing about that day at the Outpatient Imaging Center in Ohio felt out of the ordinary. It was just a regular Tuesday. The hallways were clean, bright from those typical fluorescent lights, and so quiet. And that's how Adela Merrick ended up spending part of her afternoon there. At 34, Adela was a freelance videographer with a modest but steady following, known for documenting everyday life. She had a sharp eye for the mundane, paired with a personable, curious nature that translated easily on camera. That day, she had simply accompanied a friend to a routine imaging appointment, but somewhere between the waiting room and the hallway, she spotted something that caught her eye, something worth filming. As a child, I dreamt of becoming a videographer myself. I really admire how they turn ordinary scenarios into something wonderful. The imaging center had an active MRI unit operating that afternoon. Staff had placed clear boundary markings on the floor outside the MRI room, a standard precaution that every facility running that kind of equipment maintains. A steel oxygen tank, roughly 40 pounds, sat on a cart just outside the MRI room, positioned on the safe side of the boundary line. It had been left there during a patient transition, a brief window when the room door was open and the machine remained fully active. The indicator lights on the panel outside the room were on. Adela started filming, stepping closer to the boundary and framing the warning signs as visuals instead of instructions. The signs, floor markings, and blinking panel became background texture, ordinary details she used to build her shot. And that's when she noticed the oxygen tank on the cart beside her. It became a natural next beat in her mind. Here was this industrial object sitting right at the edge of the forbidden zone, practically begging to be part of the frame. She could hold it, tilt it toward the camera, use it to punctuate the warning signs surrounding it, a prop that underlined the point she was already making. She set her camera to continue recording and reached for the tank. What happened next took less than a second. At first, she may not have even registered the resistance, the pull, as anything unusual. But the moment she lifted the tank and stepped past the boundary line, the magnetic field took over. The tank was ripped forward with a force that witnesses described as instantaneous and total. Her hands couldn't release it in time. The momentum carried her upper body forward with the tank, and she was driven into the space between the tank and the MRI scanner housing. Her chest and neck were pinned immediately. Staff responded within moments. The priority was initiating the emergency shutdown sequence to quench the magnetic field, a process that cannot be skipped or shortened without risking additional harm. Until the field was safely reduced, the tank could not be moved. That window, however brief, was enough. When the tank was finally removed and Adela was freed, she was unresponsive. Resuscitation was attempted on site and continued by emergency responders who arrived shortly after. She was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was listed as compressive asphyxia and blunt force trauma. The facility's incident report confirmed that all standard safety protocols had been in place and properly communicated. The tank had been positioned on the correct side of the line. Investigators found no procedural failure on the part of the staff. The lesson I took from this isn't about the freak accident itself. It's about what happens when we start treating warnings like just another piece of content instead of the information they're meant to be. A lot of you said in my last video this could never happen to you, but stories like this prove how quickly things can go wrong. This next case is harder. No camera, no stunt, just a tired warehouse worker making hot chocolate. It was July 4th, 2016, and a backyard in Arizona was already running hot by mid-afternoon. The kind of heat that makes concrete shimmer and turns every cold drink into a priority. It was a holiday gathering, casual, loud, and centered entirely around the pool. The water was clear, the deep end dropping to about 8 feet, with smooth vertical walls and no ledge to grab onto once you were in. Gary Vost was 29, a construction laborer laborer who worked long weeks and spent his days off making up for them. From what everyone there said, he just loved having people watch him. He was physical, confident from years of manual work, and he had a habit of turning ordinary moments into something worth remembering. Someone had brought a large block of ice, well over 300 pounds, to float in the pool as a novelty centerpiece. The block had been hauled in on a dolly before guests arrived and set down on the wet pool deck, where it sat low and stable until someone suggested sliding it in. Multiple people later told investigators that when the idea of pushing it into the water came up, there were voices who flagged it as unpredictable. Ice that size doesn't float perfectly level. The moment it leaves a flat surface, its center of gravity shifts and water finds every imbalance. I came across a similar setup online once, people using a large ice block to chill the water at a summer party. It looked like a fun idea, harmless even. He positioned himself near the pool's edge, between the ice block and the wall, as others began sliding it in. He wasn't just watching, he was involved, close to the action. That was the decision. Not one dramatic moment, but a series of small ones, standing in that spot, staying there as the block moved, not stepping back when he still could. What was he thinking, standing right there at the pool's edge, squeezed between something that weighed as much as 2 refrigerators and a concrete wall? The block went into the water unevenly. Witnesses described it tilting as it entered, one side dropping faster than the other. Once in the water, it began a slow rotation, not violent, just the steady, physics-driven drift of something that massive, redistributing its weight as buoyancy took over. Gary lost his footing on the wet deck and slipped into the gap between the ice and the pool wall. What followed was not fast. The ice didn't slam into him. It pressed, slowly. The rotation continued at the same unhurried pace, and as it did, the gap narrowed. His arms were pinned first, removing any ability to push back or pull himself up. The wall behind him was smooth, no ladder, no grip, nothing to brace against. His chest was forced against the concrete, and his head was gradually pushed below the surface. People on the deck tried. Multiple guests attempted to push the block away, to stop the rotation, to create enough space for Gary to get free. At over 300 pounds, with buoyancy making it resistant to any downward force, and its wet surface offering no real grip, they couldn't redirect it in time. The block drifted on its own timeline. By the time it shifted away naturally, Gary had been submerged too long. He was pulled from the water unresponsive. CPR was started immediately. Emergency services arrived and continued resuscitation. He was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was drowning with compressive restriction as a contributing factor. The county investigation concluded no criminal negligence was involved. Witness statements were consistent, and the block was examined as part of the scene documentation. I spent hours thinking about Gary's case and kept coming back to the same thought. Some deaths happen because people ignore danger completely, while others happen because they get too comfortable around it. The next story falls into that second category, because this time the fatal mistake started the moment a loaded gun became part of the camera shot. It was June 14, 2017, and an open stretch of desert outside a small Nevada town was doing exactly what that kind of terrain does in mid-June, radiating heat off the ground in waves, flat, dry, dusty, with a low ridge of dirt built up at the back of the clearing that locals used as a backstop for target practice. It wasn't a real range. No staff, no rules posted, no safety officer, just public land used informally by people who wanted to shoot bottles and cans without driving to a managed facility. A small group had driven out that afternoon for casual target practice. Larice Weldon was 24, a retail associate who spent most weekends looking for something more interesting than her routine. People described her as curious and social, the type to say yes to plans she had no real experience with just because it sounded fun. But lately, that wasn't feeling like enough. She had started posting more online, short clips, quick edits, trying to build something that stood out. Nothing had really taken off yet. A few likes here and there, but nothing that stuck. And out there in the desert, with the lighting, the open space, and the echo of gunfire, It felt like the kind of setting that could finally get attention. I can relate to Larice. It's really fun to learn something new, but there's also that pull, the urge to capture it, to make it look effortless, to show people you're doing something bold. The group set up bottles and cans on the dirt berm, roughly 20 yards out. Larice rotated in and took her turns. She wasn't trained, just picking things up as she went, relying on quick corrections between shots. After a while, one of her friends pulled out a phone and started recording short clips. Nothing serious at first. That's where the shift happened. After firing a few rounds, Larice stepped off to the side of the line, still holding a loaded pistol. She glanced at the phone, then at the open desert behind her, and you can almost see the idea forming. Not just shooting, presenting it. She suggested filming a more stylized clip, not just standing and firing, but a pose, something that looked controlled, confident, the kind of shot that makes it seem like you know what you're doing, even if you don't. Her attention shifted from the firearm to how she looked on camera. She turned toward the phone, holding the pistol one-handed at chest level. As she adjusted her grip to angle it across her body, her finger stayed inside the trigger guard. As her grip shifted, her hand tightened reflexively. It was a small, instinctive movement, but it was enough. The pistol discharged at close range across her torso. The sound hit instantly. She dropped the firearm and collapsed beside the firing area. For a moment, no one moved. Then everything accelerated. One friend secured the weapon. Another called emergency services, trying to describe a location that didn't really have an address. They stayed with her while they waited. But the clearing was remote. Response time was longer than it would have been in a populated area. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The official cause of death was listed as a self-inflicted gunshot wound caused by unsafe handling of a loaded firearm during a distracted moment. Investigators reviewed the recording from the friend's phone, which captured the seconds leading up to the discharge. Owning a gun isn't just about possession. It comes with responsibility. The moment your focus shifts, even slightly, it can turn into real danger. The next story I looked into hit differently, because this time, the person knew exactly what they were doing. They just never stopped to ask whether they should be doing it at all. It was January 9th, 2018, and a residential garage workshop in Michigan was holding on to the kind of cold that settles in and doesn't leave. The temperature outside had been below freezing for days. Snow had been tracked in and out of the garage repeatedly, and the concrete floor had a damp sheen to it, not puddled, but wet enough that you could see the reflection of the overhead light bouncing off the surface in patches. Kenneth Drake spent a lot of his free time in that garage. Kenneth, 37, worked as an appliance repair helper and had years of hands-on experience with wiring and small electrical systems. Though not licensed, he was confident around motors and circuits. He valued self-sufficiency, made extra cash salvaging copper from old appliances, and preferred doing things quickly rather than by the book. That afternoon, he was working on a discarded appliance someone had given him. The plan was simple: cut the power cord off, strip it for the copper inside, and move on to the next one. It's the kind of task he had done many times before. Here's the part where the decisions stack up. The appliance was switched off, but it was still plugged into a live outlet. Kenneth didn't unplug it. He went for the section of cord closest to the appliance itself, which meant he was working between two live wires sitting in a household outlet on the other end. He was using a pair of regular metal scissors, not insulated wire cutters, just standard household scissors, and he was standing on a damp concrete floor in work boots that had picked up moisture from the snow tracked in earlier. Kenneth knew better. He'd been around this stuff for years, but that afternoon, he decided the shortcut was worth it, and that choice was just plain stupid. He placed the scissors across the cord and squeezed. The blades made contact with both conductors at the same time. The moment that happened, the damp floor and wet boots gave that current an easy path out of his body. Here's the part that makes electrocution different from almost any other accident. When household current passes through the hands, the muscles in the forearms contract involuntarily. The grip locks. You cannot let go of what you're holding, even if your brain is screaming at your hand to release. Kenneth's hands stayed clamped on the scissors. The circuit stayed closed. The current kept flowing. He remained in contact with the energized tool for several seconds before his body finally collapsed backward, breaking the connection. By that point, the damage was done. Current had passed through his chest long enough to disrupt his heart rhythm. He was found unresponsive on the garage floor a short time later by a family member. Emergency responders arrived and attempted resuscitation. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death was listed as electrocution. The investigation report noted the scissors recovered at the scene, the appliance still plugged into the wall, the damp condition of the floor, and the absence of any insulated tools or protective equipment in the immediate work area. Investigators concluded the death was accidental, the result of contact with an energized circuit during an unsafe cord-cutting attempt. Experience can give you confidence, but it can also convince you that the rules don't apply to you. Electricity isn't impressed by your years on the job. It reacts the same way, no matter who you are. I keep coming back to how preventable Kenneth's death was. 2 minutes of unplugging a cord would have changed everything. But the next case made me realize that 2 minutes isn't always the issue. Sometimes the warning is shouted at you in real time by people standing right next to you, and you do it anyway. It was November 3rd, 2016, and a backyard in some small town in Missouri was having one of those chill fall nights with no real plan. Everyone had drifted toward the fire pit because the air had gotten that crisp fall chill. Macy Stallard was 26, a warehouse worker who had spent the last few years on her feet for 10-hour shifts at a time. People who knew her described her as outgoing, impatient with slow situations, and the type of person who got bored quickly when the energy in a room dropped. Impatience was a part of her personality. As the fire started to fade, Macy headed to the detached garage and came back with a plastic gas can. She'd used it earlier for the lawnmower, and you could hear the fuel sloshing as she walked. People noticed right away. Several voices spoke up, telling her not to do it, not to pour gasoline on a live fire. Someone even offered to grab kindling instead. Macy just brushed them off. If you were standing there that night, would you have done what Macy did? She opened the cap on the gas can, walked to the edge of the fire pit, and tilted the container forward. Here's what witnesses saw, reconstructed from the consistent accounts they gave responding investigators. The first thing that happened wasn't visible flame contact. Gasoline doesn't need direct flame to ignite. The vapor coming off the surface of the fuel is what catches first, and those vapors travel upward and outward through the air. As soon as the stream tilted toward the embers, the vapors above the fire ignited. That ignition traveled visibly along the line of the fuel stream, moving backward toward the container in her hand. People described it as a fast, clean line of fire chasing the gasoline back to its source. When the flame reached the opening of the can, the fuel inside the container ignited as well. The can did not behave like a sealed object. It behaved like an open vessel full of burning liquid. Flames expanded outward from the opening, and the fuel that had already poured out spilled across her torso, arms, and the ground at her feet. Her clothing caught immediately. The dry grass around the fire pit caught a moment after. Bystanders moved fast. People grabbed jackets, water, anything within reach, trying to smother the flames. Emergency services were called within minutes. By the time first responders arrived, the fire on the ground had been contained, but Macy had sustained severe thermal injuries across most of her upper body and arms. She was transported to a regional medical facility. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The official cause of death was listed as extensive thermal injuries from a flash fire ignition event. The gas can was recovered at the scene, partially melted but identifiable. This story reminded me of something that happened to me before. Someone at a bonfire grabbed a gas can, thinking it would kick the fire back up. A few of us shouted right away, and luckily they stopped before pouring. That moment hits me because it showed how close things can get to disaster in just one wrong move. Macy ignored the people standing next to her. The next person I covered ignored something far quieter, a posted sign and a predator that had been there the whole time. It was May 28, 2017, and a small golf course in Central Florida sat in the warm, humid stillness of a late spring afternoon. The fairways were quiet. The pond near a back hole lay mirror flat, and posted signs clearly warned about alligators, telling players to keep their distance and not approach. Right there on the edge of the pond, partly in the shallow water, was a large alligator, later estimated by wildlife officers to be around 9 to 10 feet long. It wasn't hiding at all. It was out in the open, sunning itself in the exact spot the warning signs were talking about. That's where Valerie ended up that afternoon. Valerie Kinsley was 31, a sales representative for a regional company who spent most of her week in meetings, on calls, and on the road. She had joined a small group of friends for a casual round at the course that day. Not a serious outing, more of a social one. People who knew her described her as competitive in a friendly way, drawn to anything that made a good story afterward. When the group reached the pond and noticed the alligator, the others stayed back. Valerie didn't. According to the friends who were with her, she walked off the cart path, past the warning signage, and moved toward the bank with her phone out. She wanted a photo, a close one. And the alligator, lying still in the shallows, looked to her like an easy subject. The animal didn't move as she approached. That's the part people misread the most about alligators. Stillness is not safety. It's the default state of an ambush predator that is conserving energy and waiting to see what happens next. She closed the distance to within a few feet. The photo wasn't dramatic enough on its own. She wanted movement in the shot, a reaction, a head turn, something that made the image worth posting. So she extended her foot and nudged the animal. I don't know if Valerie is brave or just plain stupid going near an alligator like that. If I were in her shoes, I'd run as far as I could. Even the sight of its tail would be enough to send me away. The alligator's response was immediate. Witnesses described the movement as fast, low, and direct, a single lunge that closed the remaining distance before she could step back. It caught her leg. The grip locked. Within the next second, her balance was gone and she was on the ground. What followed lined up with documented alligator behavior. The animal pulled her sideways toward the water. As she was dragged across the bank, it began the rotational movement that alligators use to subdue prey, the death roll. Her friends ran toward the pond, shouting and trying to find anything they could use to intervene, but the animal had already moved her into shallow water by then. The rotations continued. She was submerged repeatedly during the struggle. Course staff and emergency services were called within the first minute. By the time wildlife officers and first responders arrived, the alligator had moved off and Valerie was recovered from the water. She was unresponsive at the scene. Resuscitation was attempted. She was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was listed as drowning with traumatic injuries. Wildlife officers located and trapped the alligator the following day. The animal was confirmed through bite measurement and biological evidence as the one involved. The lesson in Valerie's case is the one I wish more people took seriously. Wild animals are not props. They are not part of the scenery. You should respect their boundaries. Valerie walked toward the danger. The next victim did the opposite. She stood completely still, and that turned out to be just as deadly. It was July 2nd, 2015, and an open field on the outskirts of a small town in Indiana was the kind of place teenagers and young adults end up when they want to do something without anyone telling them not to. Flat ground, no nearby houses, a dirt access road running along one edge. The grass had been cut down to about ankle height earlier in the summer. The sun was setting low on the horizon, and the air was still. No real wind to speak of, which is a detail that matters more than people think when fireworks are involved. With no wind, anything that gets launched goes exactly where it's pointed. A small group of friends had gathered there that evening with a stash of consumer fireworks ahead of the July 4th weekend. Most of it was the standard stuff: small mortars, fountains, sparklers. Among the pile was a bottle rocket, the kind sold at roadside stands, designed to be stuck into the ground or a glass bottle, fuse pointed up, so it launches vertically before bursting in the air. That's the whole design. Vertical, up. away from people. Louise Weldon was 22, a college student home for the summer, working a part-time job and spending most of her free nights with the same group of friends she'd grown up with. The people who knew her described her as bright, easygoing, the kind of person who agreed to things to keep the energy moving even when she wasn't fully sure about them. She wasn't the ringleader in the group. She wasn't the cautious one either. She was the one who went along. That night, someone in the group had an idea. Instead of pointing the bottle rocket up, they were going to aim it horizontally, laid flat on the ground, fuse facing one direction, the rocket pointed the other. And to make the video interesting, someone needed to stand at the other end in the line of fire as a sort of human target. The plan was that the rocket would either miss, fly past, or burn out before reaching the person standing there. That person was Louise. I just don't get it. Why would anyone put themselves in that kind of danger just for a clip? She positioned herself in the open field, about 15 to 20 feet away from where the rocket was set up. Others in the group spread out at varying distances to record from different angles. She stood facing the device, still waiting. The fuse was lit. A bottle rocket aimed horizontally does not rise. It does not curve upward. It travels in a straight line at the height it was launched from, which in this case was ground level. The device cleared the launch point in a fraction of a second, crossed the open distance between the two ends of the setup in under a second, and struck her directly in the neck area. The detonation occurred on impact. Friends on scene called emergency services immediately. CPR was started by someone in the group while waiting for paramedics. Responders arrived within minutes, but the injury, both the impact trauma and the explosive component at point of contact, was not survivable. She was pronounced dead at the scene. No charges were filed against the others involved, but the report documented the role each person played in the setup. This story makes me realize that sometimes the most important decision I can make is refusing to go along with something that already feels off. Louise's mistake was trusting the people around her. The next story flips that entirely. This time, the only person he listened to was himself. It was August 19, 2018, and a small restaurant event space in Central Texas was wrapping up the kind of summer Sunday locals look forward to all month. The place wasn't fancy, a family-owned spot that hosted casual community events on weekends. That afternoon, the venue was running an eating contest, the kind held for fun and a small cash prize. The dining room had been rearranged into a U-shape, with a long table at the center where contestants sat shoulder to shoulder. Spectators crowded in close behind them, phones up, recording, calling out encouragement. The air was warm, the room was loud, and the energy was the exact kind that makes people forget they have limits. Jared Loft was 45, a delivery driver who had spent most of his adult life on the road making routes for a regional company. People who knew him described him as competitive in a quiet way, not loud about it, not showy, but the kind of person who hated losing. He had signed up on a whim, partly because his friends thought it would be funny, and partly because he believed he could take it. He wasn't a professional eater. He had no training. What he had was confidence and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't know when to stop. The contest had a basic rule structure: continuous eating, no pauses, first to finish wins. That continuous part is the detail that ended up mattering most. Jared started strong. Witnesses said he was holding his own through the first half. Then, as others slowed or paused to drink water, he made the decision that separated this story from every other contest that ends with a sore stomach. He stopped chewing properly. He started placing multiple pieces in his mouth at once. He skipped the small breaks the other contestants were taking. He prepared to swallow a large portion in one go. This is the part I can't forget. Jared wasn't being forced to do it, and the prize wasn't even that big, yet he pushed past what his body was clearly telling him. The food lodged in his airway during the swallow attempt. What witnesses described next lined up with what choking actually looks like. Not the dramatic version people imagine, but the quiet version that's harder to catch in a loud room. He stood up abruptly. He tried to inhale. No sound came out, no coughing, no gasping, because there was no airflow at all. A completely blocked airway doesn't make noise. He remained upright for several seconds, hands moving toward his throat. Someone noticed and called out. Staff moved in. Abdominal thrusts were attempted by a server with training. The obstruction didn't clear. He collapsed forward onto the table. Paramedics arrived within minutes and continued airway clearance during transport. The obstruction was eventually removed at the hospital, but by then the time without oxygen had already done the damage that mattered. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The official cause of death was listed as airway obstruction, resulting in fatal asphyxiation. The county investigation reviewed multiple cell phone recordings from spectators, all of which captured different segments of the event. The footage confirmed the sequence: the accelerated pace, the multi-piece mouthful, the moment of obstruction, and the response time of bystanders. The death was ruled accidental. The venue cooperated fully, and the event format was discontinued shortly after. Jared's story taught me that when your body tells you something, you should listen. The moment you push past those signals just to grab a small win, you're already putting yourself at risk for way more than it's worth.